Blue State Coffee. So this is the Green Café. We do monthly presentations, first Thursday of every month, 4 o'clock, usually in the greenhouse, but there's a class down there, so we're doing it up here in Marsh Hall. And it's my pleasure to introduce Gina Grafau and Benjamin Tolston from Blue State Coffee. So Ben is the head roaster and green buyer of Blue State, and Gina Grafau is the coffee director. And so, for these green cafes, actually, I spent a little bit of time meeting with the people before to talk about what they want to, talk about, and we come up with a theme and stuff. So I have to say, this is the first time we've ever had a PowerPoint slides with our green cafes. Usually, we don't have any PowerPoint. So we can't do that down at the greenhouse. But you can see our title here, Coffee and You, a Cupping. And so the two themes that came up when I was talking with Gina was that coffee is all about you. It's how you taste it, right? So, you can give people hints, and I think they're going to do that. You can see from the handouts, they're going to give you hints about what the flavors may be like, but you're going to have to experience them yourselves. And then the cupping part is that they do cuppings. Blue State does cuppings, so they take new coffees, and you can go down there, and they'll probably give you some dates and times. You can go down there and try out new coffees that they have if you really are a coffee aficionado. So I'm going to hand it over to them now, and there's going to be some tastings, and we're going to taste different foods, and so they'll take care of the rest. So take it away, guys.
How's everyone doing? All right, show of hands, who here loves coffee? All right, you are all my friends. As Josh said, my name's Ben. I'm the head roaster and green buyer for Blue State Coffee. What that means is I am in charge of overseeing all the roasting for all of our cafes. We have 8 cafes in now 4 different cities: Providence, Boston, New Haven, and we just opened our most recent cafe in downtown Hartford. So I oversee all of the roasting. We roast all of our coffees in-house. We provide that coffee for ourselves. So that gives me the control to choose and select our coffees and roast them to our preferences and how we want to present the individual coffees, whether it's a blend or a single origin coffee or a micro lot that we have a relationship with specifically in Costa Rica. So that's part of my job, and I'll let Gina talk about what she does.
So I also work at all 8 locations. My primary job is to oversee the cafe's coffee programs. So that's making sure the managers are training the baristas correctly in both bar training and just basic coffee knowledge and brewing. I do quality control. I taste all the drinks all the time. I never have a whole drink because I would be spastic and freaking out. But I'm tasting all the different drinks anywhere from lemonade to cold brew. And those are kind of the extremes of the two. I also help with maintenance of equipment, and if anybody goes wrong with their espresso machine, I will troubleshoot and potentially fix any of their equipment. So that's basically what I help with at the store level. And Ben and I try to work together and figure out what we want to present to our customers and what you all like. So. Oh, and once a week I do a cupping. So on Wednesdays at 11 o'clock. They're free, they're open to the public. It is a bad time for most people, but it is the best time to do a cupping because it's after breakfast and before a heavy lunch. And that's when your palate is most ready for coffee. So, but I may change that so it's more welcoming to our actual population here in New Haven. So.
Awesome. Well, who here knows what a cupping is? Have you guys heard of the phrase cupping? What do you imagine it to be, the phrase cupping? It's pretty interesting. Cupping is the manner in which coffee professionals evaluate. What we do is we grind a specific small amount of coffee into a bowl. It's a little cupping bowl, and you just add hot water, very similar to a French press, which I'm sure you've seen. It's just coffee sitting in a little bowl. Add hot water, let it steep for 4 minutes, and then after that, we take the crust that's out of the bowl, and then we take a spoon and we taste, i.e. slurp that coffee. And that is how coffee is evaluated, graded. One of the things we're going to discuss a little bit later, there's an actual cupping score sheet in terms of how coffees are given a grade used by this evaluation method. So that's what Gina was just discussing. That's something that we do for our customers in the store. Typically, if you see cupping, or a public cupping, you can assume that's going to be a coffee tasting. So that's pretty much what we're going to be doing today, only we're doing it kind of in a larger method. We've brewed 4 different coffees for you to try, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those. So one of the things that we do at Blue State Coffee is we have several different house blends that we serve in store to maintain consistency. So when you, our customers, come in, you know what to expect. You come in getting our house cup of coffee, you can expect it to be the same every time you come in. Typically, coffee is very interesting in that it is a agricultural product. It's a crop that grows and changes with the seasons, and everything from where it's grown to how it's processed, shipped, received, roasted, and thus prepared will affect how that tastes. All that to say, we strive for consistency in our blends, and part of my job as a head roaster is selecting the coffees that will match those. So the blend that we have for you today is our espresso blend, and it's made up of 3 different coffees from 3 different places. The first coffee is a Sumatra coffee, so it's an Indonesian coffee. The second coffee is a coffee from Colombia, and then the third coffee is a coffee from Mexico. So there's 3 coffees from different parts of the world, all blended together to make one coffee that we use in-house for our espresso, but it can be used just like any other coffee could, however you would like to brew it, whether it's by drip, French press, pour over, kind of, you name it. So to start, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Sumatra, where that coffee comes from, its processing, and what it brings to the blend. So the Sumatra is obviously in Indonesia. Its processing is wet hold, which means it's taken from the tree, and it's a little bit different from coffee in another region, say Costa Rica or Mexico and Colombia, in that it's dried in the cherry and the seasons there. They don't do what's called washing it. So I guess I should start with the Mexico and Colombia before I describe the wet hold process. So the Colombia and the Mexico, they're both a washed processed coffee. What that means is the coffee's cherries picked from the tree and then collected, gathered, and then it's run through a depulper, and then it's washed off. All the fruit of the cherry is washed off of the seed of the bean itself. And then it's dried typically on patios, mechanical dryers, sometimes raised beds, depending on the country. There's different drying methods that will also affect the flavor of that coffee. So that's a washed coffee. The Sumatra is not a washed coffee. It's typically a little bit grungier. It's left to dry in the cherry. It's very similar to a natural process, which is just dried in the cherry itself. So different regions might dry the coffee in the cherry itself, where there's limited water availability. So one of the things you could expect from Sumatra is it is a very heavy-bodied coffee. What I mean by heavy-bodied is that the weight of it when it sits on your tongue is heavier than something like that of a washed coffee. It has a very earthy nature to it. So we've paired it with some dried cherries, I believe, to kind of influence and see. So when we go through the tasting of the coffee, I just encourage you to taste it black first, and then if you need a little encouragement to taste what's there, you can use the dried cherries as well. The Colombia coffee is a washed process, as I mentioned, and that coffee, what that brings to the blend is kind of our more citrusy element. Has a little bit more acidity than the Sumatra, which I mentioned is heavy body, low acidity. Now what acidity is basically the electric feeling you would feel on your tongue. You guys ever had Pop Rocks? You put that in your mouth, it kind of like activates your mouth. that's how I would describe acidity in coffee. I've heard a friend of mine describe acidity as what makes specialty coffee kind of special. Lower grown coffees, coffee that would be considered commodity or just kind of run-of-the-mill, nothing very unique about it, has very little to no acidity. So there's nothing really special about it. It's just kind of a general coffee. Think like Folgers, stuff that you get in the can, instant ground coffee, that type of stuff, which most people associate with coffee is kind of like bitter, and acidity kind of brings you out of that world and into the realm of specialty coffee. And acidity, we'll talk a little bit about this when we discuss our grading cupping form, which was passed out. But there's different levels of acidity. You can compare acidity or types of acidity, like does it have the acidity of an apple versus the acidity of a grapefruit, the acidity of an orange. So all these different things have different like activities that we would sense in how we're tasting it. So all that to say, part of our espresso blend, the Columbia is what's bringing kind of the more colorful liveliness to the espresso. So we have paired with that grapefruit juice to kind of hint along with that. And then the Mexico, which is the base of our blend, it's a coffee from the Oaxaca region. It is kind of, as a coffee, it's kind of what's bringing kind of the base element for both the Sumatra and the Colombia is carrying the acidity and the earthiness, but it's a very kind of smooth chocolate, almost dark chocolate kind of smokiness to it. Not super smoky as in burnt, but like really nice dark chocolate with the orange and cherry thrown on top between those coffees. And so that's what gives us what we call our espresso number 9. So if you go into any of our cafes and you're getting a milk drink or like a latte, cappuccino, or just espresso on its own, anything that they're doing over by the espresso machine, this is the coffee that we're using. So those are the coffees in the blend. Let's talk about tasting them. So you all received a handout, I believe. Did everybody get one? No. I think we got some extras up here.
Yeah.
One more.
Here we go. Oh, did you get that one?
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Is this one yours, guys?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so this form is the Specialty Coffee Association of America coffee cupping form. It is very technical. There's a lot of little boxes and a lot of little lines. This is the form that coffee professionals use to actually grade and score a coffee. So when people are at different coffee origins tasting coffee, they'll use this form to give it a score, a value, a grade. And everywhere up to exporter, importer, we all use this form and the numbers that it generates as a way of saying this is a really good coffee, I want to buy it. So specialty coffee, for most of Blue State's coffee that we purchase are in the 84 to 85 range. That's just kind of general specialty coffee, means it's a cut above the rest. And once you move into 85, 86 score, it's just how the numbers add up. I'm not going to go through all of that because we're only going to hit on a few specific ones of the sheet. But 85, 86 is kind of, this coffee is a little bit more unique. Might want to pay attention or maybe present it as its own, as a single origin. And then once you move past 86 into 87, 88, 89, Those number scores are just saying this coffee is really good. So as a coffee professional, if I heard from my importer or whoever's selling me green coffee saying, hey, I've got this coffee, it's an 89, I think you'll really like it. I'm going to really pay attention because that's a really high scoring coffee. It's going to be really phenomenal. So this is just a standard that the industry uses across the board to evaluate coffee and communicate what we're seeing and tasting. So this form and the active cupping itself is, as I mentioned, kind of the standard of how we evaluate coffee, but this is, to me, one of the most fascinating things about it is that this process is what determines the livelihood of farmers at origin. This process is what determines how we decide what goes into a blend. This process is what determines what we're serving our customers, and even what you guys like if you wanted to use a cupping score sheet yourself to evaluate coffee and say, hey, I like coffees that are high in acidity or low in body, or hey, I really like coffees that are, you know, really kind of funky or don't really score that well, you know? Or you might say, like, this cupping sheet is useless to me, just give me my coffee and I'll be on my way, which is how I feel most mornings. So I'm going to kind of walk down through this right here. When I first started off in coffee, this was basically where I lived and breathed. This was kind of like my coffee Bible, you know, and I kind of went from a guy who was just like, coffee's cool, it's interesting, and then I decided I was going to get into it. Before I even worked in coffee, I was like, this is interesting, I'm going to do it right, so I'm just going to get the darkest stuff I can. I'm going to make a French press, and I'm going to drink it blacker than a sinner's heart. And then I realized that there was more to it, and I started tasting. But when I first started working in coffee, this is kind of what I would use. I would taste different coffees, and I would go through like, okay, fragrance and aroma. What's this coffee smell like? Is it really strong? Is it not very fragrant at all? Is it very dull? Is it just coffee, you know? And that's usually the case. Coffee is all going to smell like coffee. And then there's flavor, aftertaste, everything's kind of scored. You'll see here from 6 to 10. Acidity, which I mentioned a little bit, you can give it a score from 6 to 10, either in preference, intensity, high to low. Sweetness, is the coffee sweet? There's sugars inherent in coffee. Body, you can give it a score. Balance would be the balance of these different things. And then we'll see over here, kind of, this is just not something we're going to go through, but you see 5 different boxes. Typically, the actual Specialty Coffee Association of America cupping procedure involves using 5 different cups of the same coffee where they're weighed out individually, ground individually. So you can isolate if there's a bad bean or something that was under roasted or something that's a defect. You can isolate it to just that cup, as opposed to like if you just ground all the coffee at once, then you're not really going to know, hey, this coffee was okay, but there was just that one cup. And as I mentioned, this could really come into play when you're talking about somebody who's selling their coffee, a producer at origin. You know, they might get written off because their coffee wasn't cut that well. So that's why we have this scenario, why we do 5 cups. Uniformity kind of grades that. You know, you could check off one if one was a little off. Ideally, that's what you're looking for a specialty coffee grade. Clean cup is an interesting thing. Typically, the coffee should taste clean. Industry-wise, kind of viewed as the standard, but it's kind of flawed in the sense of like, this isn't very good for grading something like a Sumatra, because clean cup is automatically going to be off in that because it's not really a clean cup. It's processed a little bit different. You know, the cupping score is more bent towards washed coffees. So there are people at work who are creating different things or a different form for different types of processing, which is really interesting. And more fits the bill, so you're not going to judge a coffee for what it's not already by the measurements that you have set. And then you add things up, and you can say, overall, I really like this coffee. Regardless of what these things said, I'm going to give it some more points, and then that's where everything adds up. So when we're going through it and we're tasting our coffees, the things we're going to pay attention to today is column 2, flavor, or the top of column 2, flavor. We're going to look at acidity and also the body of these individual coffees. So you can use that form to take notes once we start tasting things, which will be in a moment. So let's see here. I'll show you some other things. This is just another cupping form, not the specialty coffees, but you can see there's different types. We have all of these printed up top, at the table here, up front, I mean. And this is another one, you can see this is just different forms that people have used to evaluate different coffees. So once again, cupping is an evaluation method that gives us a common language as an industry, so we can communicate effectively about any given coffee and kind of bring the outliers closer together. So I can go to another place who's familiar or work with another producer, importer, another person in the coffee supply chain who's familiar with the cupping form, and we can talk about a coffee without having to sit next to each other and taste it and say, I taste this. Well, I think you're wrong. I'm not tasting that. You know? So we have the form to help. So these are brief descriptions of commonly used cupping terms. I'll go over this right here. Fragrance is how we would describe the smell of ground coffee. Aroma would be the smell of that ground coffee once you add hot water to it. Acidity, the brightness and or sourness of coffee. It's a pretty briefer description than I mentioned. Body, the mouthfeel or heaviness perceived on the surface of the tongue. Flavor, defined as taste and aroma, midtones of coffee. I would consider flavor almost the character of the coffee. Sweetness, subtle, pleasant sweetness in coffee. Clean cup. Transparency in the cup should be free of off flavors and defects. Balance, overall rating of coffee. No one parameter should dominate. Aftertaste, duration of positive flavor attributes in coffee. Overall, your overall rating of this coffee. So that's kind of a little breakdown of everything on there. So we're going to look at here, it's the fun stuff, this is the colorful stuff. This right here is a coffee taster's flavor wheel. This is kind of what we live and die by in terms of communicating what we're tasting in coffee. So we'll use something like this. This is developed by a company called Counterculture. The Specialty Coffee Association of America, or SCAA, has their own, which is a little bit similar. We like using Countercultures because it's a little bit more user-friendly in terms of the terms that it uses to describe.
This is the user-friendly one.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
just as a heads up.
Which you have as a handout as well. So this is kind of what we're going to use as we're tasting the coffee as well.
And the way you read it is to kind of go from the center out. So you want to first identify, is it more fruity, is it more spicy, is it more savory, things like that. And then kind of, okay, well if it's fruity, is it more of a citrus, high acidic fruit, or more of a sweet fruit, or almost candy like dried fruit. So, sorry.
No, that's really good. So that's like, this is a really great way for coffee professionals to communicate with one another and say like, hey, this is a really nutty coffee that has some citrus elements. I think you'll like it. I can know what people are talking about. And then we kind of use it for describing our coffees as well and just aligning with one another. You know, so Gina, as our coffee director, kind of being more out in the open in all of the cafes, kind of on the ground level, tasting things. We'll use this as kind of our common identifier of language. So she could say, hey, the espresso's tasting a little sour, you know. And if she says something like sour like grapefruit, then I can understand what she's tasting like, or what she's talking about without actually having to be there. And obviously, the more you use something like this, and the more you taste with other people, if you choose to do that, or just the more you talk about it and the more you get your head in this space, the easier it is to identify different flavors in coffee. And so Gene and I, you know, have to spend less time doing that because we've tasted coffee together and we know what one another are talking about when I, mention, hey, this coffee's a little off, here's what I'm sensing, or in the espresso, she's like, hey, this Colombia is not as acidic as I think it should be. I can say, okay, I have an idea of what I can do as roaster to change that, and I know what she's talking about. So this is the fun stuff, and this is kind of, as Gina said, going from center out. Center is typically where I live. That's what's helpful to most people. If I say like, hey, this coffee tastes like nutmeg and licorice, I might lose someone, as opposed to like, hey, this coffee is a little spicy. Do you taste any like baking spices in there? Or like, this coffee is real fruity, or this coffee is a little earthy, kind of maybe almost a vegetable. It tastes like a cucumber or green peppers. But that's like where you get right there. You stay in here, everybody understands this. Like if I say like, hey, this tastes like a marshmallow. Like, I don't know what you mean. If I say like, oh, this tastes sweet. You're like, oh, okay, I got it. And then over here, this column, we've got body. These are just different descriptions of body. And these are really helpful. You have things like watery. If you were to imagine drinking water, what does that feel like? Along your tongue or inside of your mouth, tea-like. Then you have silky, slick, juicy, smooth. Then there's description 2% milk. What's the weight of that feel like? Obviously, it's a little bit creamer. Feels different in your mouth. If you were to take all the senses away of like flavor and or taste, and just put milk in your mouth versus water, you'd probably be able to tell the difference. So we use this kind of as a description of the body of the coffee. And then over here, adjectives and intensifiers for coffee. This is just kind of more descriptors that you can use to describe your coffee. Hey, this coffee's complex. I'm tasting a lot of things right now, but I can't really pin it on one thing. This coffee's really juicy. Right here, this coffee's lingering and dirty. It could be a good thing, that could be a bad thing. It all depends on your flavor preference. And that's kind of, to me, one of the fascinating things about coffee and why I love it is that it means so much to so many different people for so many different reasons. Even if you were to take this all away and walk out of here and say like, I don't care about any of that, I just want to drink some coffee that tastes good, however you prefer. I'm okay with that. It's really interesting. Some people think coffee definitively should be black and dirty, and roasty and bitter, and it should be like you got punched in the face. And that's how some people think coffee should be. And that person, if I say otherwise, then they might say to me, it's like, no, you're wrong. And I don't think that that is right or wrong, And at Blue State, we have our presentation, our position that we've made decisions as a business to present our coffee. But is it right or wrong? No. What we want to do is kind of find a common language to communicate that. At Blue State particularly, we've got something for everybody. So we've got, high-scoring coffees from Costa Rica and microlots, and then we've got, your really sweet smoothie stuff at our cafes, that you can add a shot of espresso to. And we like to, in training our baristas, try and communicate that and find what different customers would like. So at Blue State, that being said, we like to explore, and we're very inclusive. That's why when I said, do you guys drink coffee? You're all my friends, and that's what I'm excited about. So with that, I'd like to get started. We're going to taste some coffee. You guys ready for that? Yeah. Does anybody have any questions? Let's start here.
The water, because I know you had that thing for cleanness, and
Yeah.
The water would obviously have a bearing on the taste of the coffee. So is it better to use spring water?
Spring water, filtered coffee, yeah, that's correct, yeah. Ideally, the cleaner your water is, the more you're going to taste the coffee, so that versus what that water might be introduced into. So if it's like chlorinated water or coffee from the sink, depending on what town you live in, But like I said, that's if you want to go that extra step. Some people might not, even when I drink a cup of water, I've got a refrigerator with a filter in it, I could go and get a cup of water from there, or I could just let it fly from the sink and get my cold cup of water that way. Do I taste a difference? Yes. Ideally, would most people taste a difference in their coffee? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on how you're drinking it. But, you know, it's the same thing. It's the same, that water that you could taste the difference of between filtered or non is going into the coffee either way. So,
And then also from an equipment standpoint, water has a big deal on your equipment because it could give you lime deposits, scale deposits, things like that. So I deal with that mostly. But yeah, at home you probably don't produce enough. But if you're like, oh, this isn't dripping properly or this or that, I don't know if you guys have a cleaning regimen or things like that for your coffee equipment. But most cafes do that are worth anything because otherwise it won't taste good.
So we'd recommend clean filtered water. I wouldn't say you'd have to go out and buy like bottled water to be used for your brewing coffee, but clean filtered water is going to put you in the right spot. What's your question?
So when you guys go out and taste these, your taste buds are different in different parts of your mouth. So do you actually have a regime for how you put it in your mouth?
So I don't have something to demonstrate. The regime would be, we taste different aspects of the coffee at different stages of temperature as well. So, for example, when the coffee's hot, that's typically where you're going to notice, depending on if it's too hot, you're not really going to taste anything. You're just going to burn your tongue and kind of ruin everything else for the remainder of the coffee tasting. But typically, like, we taste things best close to body temperature, where you notice the most character or flavor of the coffee. But kind of like around 160, which is pretty hot, say 140 to 160, you're going to more notice the body. So the regime of this is kind of break it down. The way I would break it down, okay, so coffee cupping, you let the coffee steep for 4 minutes, and then you skim the crust or the coffee grounds from the top of whatever's floating there. You take that out, and then usually between 9 to 10 minutes, it's kind of when the coffee starts cooling enough where you're going to be able to actually begin to drink it. It's not piping hot. And that's where, you know, kind of like the first taste, you know, the things that I'm paying attention to there are body. You know, you're paying attention to everything all at once, but you notice different things along essentially the brew cycle of the coffee. So kind of like body is what I'll notice when it's hotter. Sweetness and everything is kind of like the middle. That's like where the balance is. And that's where most people are drinking their coffee as well. And then another thing we do is pay attention to how the coffee cools. Some coffees are really, really poor when they're hot up front, but then kind of is what I would call they open up as they cool. Really kind of like get like sweet or candy-like or just taste completely different. So even the difference in a coffee from hot to cool, the flavor of that coffee will change as well. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, it's talking more about like,
Okay, specifically, yeah.
you keep it on the front of your tongue or the back of your mouth?
Got it. I don't have anything specifically broken down. I know that there is information in terms of like tasting out there.
Well, I mean, we always try to slurp it, to spray it across our whole,
Yes.
you know, palate and see where it hits on our tongue. Does it hit the back of our throat? Does it hit down here? Things like that. But I wouldn't. There's been this whole controversy about a tongue map. Have you guys heard about this? Yeah. So one of the coffee conferences I went to was like, that doesn't exist. Everyone's tongue map is different. You've been tasting coffee all wrong. So into that I say, you can't taste something wrong. That's just my personal opinion. I think you have what you have, and you're going to interpret it. And if you can share that and build some sort of common language or connection with somebody, that's really what's important. Anyway.
So, Gina mentioned slurping. We
Yeah.
take a spoon. Let's see if I can without actual coffee. Give a slurp. But what we do is like from the spoon with the coffee in it, just a little spoonful of coffee. We slurp the coffee, and what that's doing is it's aspirating or spraying the coffee. It'd be like you're spitting it out, like only you're doing it inwards, and that's kind of covering your entire palate so you can taste that coffee. So
It's like iron passages.
yeah, you do that. You first start, it's kind of like, I don't know if I'm supposed to be doing this.
Yeah.
And then
Sometimes you cough at first. You're like,
right, and then you do it enough,
too
and
much.
then I I wish I'd thought about this ahead of time and showed you a video, but some people have a very distinct coffee slurp when you cup with them enough. So like in Costa Rica, our exporter, his name's Sebastian, he has like a little overtoned whistle. So it's like, and you can hear it, you're like, oh, there's Sebastian, which is just kind of funny and interesting. So,
I feel like there's like a slurp coffee confidence kind of correlation to the louder the slurp, usually the more confident that person is in coffee. But
Are
anyway.
there any other questions at this point? All right, you guys ready to taste some coffee? Awesome.
So how do you want to do it?
So I would say if you guys want, we could maybe, I have no idea actually. I was thinking we could go around the room so you could taste
Like I
each
can just pour it
individual
like
coffee.
that.
So as I mentioned at the beginning, we've got 3 different coffees, Sumatra, Colombia, and Mexico. 3 different coffees from 3 different regions, and then we've got all of them combined together with what makes our espresso blend. So I'll leave it up to you guys how you want to do it, and I would encourage you to just take a mental note using the cupping sheet as I described. Talking the things that we want to pay attention to are flavor, acidity, and the body of the coffee. So if you can make mental notes and just be encouraged. There's no right or wrong answer. Just taste what you taste, write something down, or just catalog it.
Yeah. After all these rules, there's no rules.
There you go.
And there's seltzer and crackers to wash in between it, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So I just want to mention, you should we don't have anywhere to spit the seltzer, so just drink it.
Yeah.
But rinse out in between, right?
So why don't we do maybe this row? You guys could start with coffee A. Maybe the second 2 rows. Actually, we've got 4 rows, so
This is coffee A.
yeah, coffee A.
There's 4 different
And
coffees.
so this
around.
one is a blend, right?
Right, this is everything all
So you want to do
together.
that one last?
Yeah, I would encourage you to taste that one last after tasting the individual
Yeah.
coffees as well.
So
Especially in
seltzer
the
first
works.
into the drink station and then
Yeah, I'd say just go for it.
Are we allowed to
So
taste?
yes, you can taste it.
Yeah, they say recommend just 2 and then not.
Actually, no, it's
Oh, you're like
coffee
chocolate,
flavor of the.
yeah, you're already gonna hint because the chocolate's on there. So but chocolate's really good.
I'm gonna make it some more.
So what was the
Hey, Sumatra.
That was awesome. That was cool. Great job. It doesn't seem like it. Yeah, it all worked out.
That part is just like, there's only so much.
You're just skipping the top.
You guys remember the coffee room again, right?
For like a month afterwards, I was like,
In
give
terms of body, it's really thick.
It's just like, just throw it.
It's bitter.
Now I remember.
Bitter.
Yeah, make sure I can do this.
It has a thick body.
Yeah, exactly.
Just throw it sometimes.
I have a grab of chocolate.
This one's from Sumatra.
Should we go on?
Yeah, go on to the next one. So yeah, so try. Yes, I haven't actually tasted this one alone, this actual brew yet, but yeah, taste each one, and basically what it is these are 3 different single origins, and then in this last one, it's how we have our espresso. So it's like 50% Mexican, 25% Colombian,
Before you
and
take it out.
25%.
Could you comment which coffees are which? Which coffees are which?
Alright, so coffee A is Sumatra, coffee B is Colombia,
Colombia, right?
and then coffee C is the Mexico.
Mexican, so I'll take Colombian coffee.
Okay, so that's the other one's Colombia.
Yeah, the one over there is Colombia.
Oh,
Very
that
much, very black.
That one is
Anyone needs an seltzer?
Sure.
It doesn't have to be a
It's not necessarily-
It's more
what's supposed to be used, I think it's a question, but in terms of what is bringing to the blend, there's a lot of
It equates in your head. The thing is that's one of the there's so many different things.
a lot of times like the brain pictures you looking for something.
So I'll put the trash can over here, make your circuit and throw it away.
Several different copies.
Could you just try the
I think we'll taste it. I can describe it to you.
Okay.
I'll say this, like when we're tasting coffee or analyzing it and cupping it, I'm not trying to bring what I want there to be. I'm not trying to influence the coffee itself. I'm simply trying to be a referee and use my own senses and say, all right, what's there? I'm not the one making the plays happen, but I'm just calling the plays as I see them in terms of what I'm tasting.
Do this every Wednesday?
Yes. Not quite like this, but yes.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, if you look at Blue State Coffee on Facebook, it says where I'll be. I switch between the three to make this work. So this next week I will be
We should have followed up wine and tasted it. We haven't done wine tasting because we do stuff with the
Couldn't help herself. She was too excited.
I did the same thing. We can do a green cafe after midnight. I did the same thing and realized like I was bored of that.
Taste off of that, or do something.
This is the best one so far.
Probably out of these three.
We're trying to slurp this home in the
No, it's this is my thing. When you go to Blue State, you never get any of these coffees. Because this is our espresso blend, and it's sharp flavor. So the only way you'll get it is through a shot espresso, which will taste very different from the shot that you get today. So we feel like
Okay, I kind of got the cherry from that one.
I'm saving that one for last.
We got a meeting tomorrow, right? Do you have a second afterward to chat about something?
We have a lab meeting.
Do we have lab meeting tomorrow? We have lab meeting tomorrow, yeah.
But
Do you
no
have,
other meeting.
no, I meant lab meeting. Can we chat just briefly again after?
I have another meeting at 10 downtown, so I'll have to leave.
What about before? Maybe.
I'm there usually by.
It's not anything.
that's the thing, you just don't know. You can't just be, oh, I don't like this kind of coffee. Yeah, no, I
Is that still,
never
did you turn it off? No, I'm just like, hey. We can turn it off.